All right, it's 6 o'clock. So this is our City Council Tax Increment District Workshop in person and via Zoom. I would like to introduce Adam Rico, who is one of our financial advisors from R.W. Baird. Adam has a ton of experience. He's just recently moved to the private sector side, representing Baird, but has many years of experience as a city manager of the city of Platteville, and then some other experiences in Hobart and other municipalities in Wisconsin as well. So he is well versed in what he's about to talk with us about. Then, so we have a presentation, and then we can talk about the status of our current tax increment districts, and then talk a little bit about what's next and timeline and that stuff. So with that, I will turn it over to Adam, who's going to present some information for us.
All right. Well, thanks, Rebecca, for the nice introduction there. Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Rico here with Baird. Obviously, Justin Fisher is the other kind of tag team partner that normally you see at meetings. So pretty much what we thought would be a good idea is to come in front of you and kind of do what we call kind of a TIP workshop. The last one we did, I think, was in 2022. Yes. So what we like to do is kind of come in, kind of give you some of the updated information that's going on, and particularly kind of focus on a couple of areas that are opportunities that will be discussed at future kind of common council meetings here for you to consider. So just to kind of give you a recap for the type of TIDs, there's basically different kind of options that you can do if you're creating it, whether you're a village, a city, or a town. So towns kind of have a different option where they can either go their own route and do what's called a town TID, or they can basically make the decision that they want to follow as if they were a village or a city. So that's kind of why you see the different breakdowns there. But primarily most TIDs, there's what's called blight. So when you think of that, imagine you have a paper mill or you have something that essentially is no longer in its current operation and is not looking good in your municipality. That is particularly a blighted district. One of the reasons you create blight is because it has a longer shelf life. So most TIDs have about 20 years. A blighted district has 27. And primarily that reason is because more than likely there's going to be some type of environmental remediation component that you're going to have to do, or particularly because it's blighted, it is going to take a lot of work to get that basically back to a kind of shovel ready status, and then be able to move forward. There's rehabilitation conservation. So again, kind of similar to blight, but that's also more where if you're trying to do, what are kind of the new terms, pocket subdivisions, different things like that, with a focus on having a lot more green space. You can kind of look at doing one of those TIDs. There's your typical industrial TID, which is primarily exactly what you would think of. That's your light manufacturing, heavy manufacturing. Mixed use is primarily the main one, which we'll talk about here in a second. That's essentially where you have to have 50% of a combination of either commercial, industrial, or residential. And you can use that throughout. And then there's environmental remediation, where essentially you have a site that is either contaminated. A lot of these happen to be, for gas stations that they didn't have the particular EPA requirements, and they know there was stuff seeping into the ground. That's primarily what a kind of environmental remediation one is. So this is information that's updated by the Department of Revenue every year, typically around May. So as you can see right now, there's currently about 1,400 active TIDs. There were 28 districts that were created before October 1st, 1995. There's 346 blight elimination TIDs, 240 rehabilitation and conservation TIDs, 228 industrial. And as you can see, mixed use is the number one at 526. So that is primarily what everybody's doing, because again, you have the ability to kind of combine three avenues to kind of look at. There's 2 town TIDs, there's 12 environmental remediation, and 18 legislative exceptions. So what that is particularly if for whatever reason you can't do something with a TID. So the example of this would be there's the 12% test, which we'll talk about a little bit. If you are over that, you can actually have your legislator lobby on your behalf to be able to create one, even though the law says you can't. That's kind of what these legislative exceptions are. It's essentially, it goes into the budget, they get it approved, and then you're able to do something that is typically outside of the kind of TIF laws. So there were 73 TID terminations effective in 2023. And then in 2023, there were 83 new TIDs that were created. 13 of them were blight, 16 were rehabilitation, 8 were industrial, and 46 were mixed use. And then in 2023, there were also 33 TID amendments. So that's either municipalities that are subtracting parcels from their TIDs, adding parcels, or doing some type of amendment in regards to projects and different things along those lines. So just briefly to kind of hit on why, again, do you create or amend a TID? Really, it comes down to the number one is the but-for test. So what you have to be able to do in order to attract a new private development that would otherwise not occur, you have to satisfy the but-for test, which means essentially if you did not create this TIF district and use essentially the revenues that are there, the project would not come. That's kind of the number one baseline that you have to meet the DOR's requirements in order to do it. So you have to be able to show, kind of the expanded tax-based development becomes cost-effective and basically the proceeds. Another reason, again, is you're able to share the costs amongst multiple taxing jurisdictions. So when you're considering, a developer coming in and kind of looking at the projects that are there, you have to be able to analyze, okay, can the city be able to take on that cost? Or does it need assistance? Again, kind of goes back to that but-for test. And then you're able to utilize, obviously, the school district, the technical college, and the county's tax rates for a period of time to help offset those costs, which then when you close the district, obviously goes to benefit all of them. So if it's a residential development, it has, benefits to the school district, it has benefits to the technical college and the county. If it's, particularly anything that is commercial or manufacturing, it does benefit them all because that helps with their equalized values, which then is what is utilized to essentially give state aids. So it all kind of plays together as a puzzle. So then again, the tax increment revenues are based on full tax rates to offset the TID project costs. And then once the TID is closed, all the overlapping taxing entities benefit from the expanded tax base. So this is kind of a nice little graph that shows the overall example of a TID life cycle. So one of the number one questions we always get with TIDs, or the concern is, well, all of the taxing jurisdictions are no longer going to receive taxes. Well, that's not necessarily true. So what happens is when you create a TIF district or you amend a TIF district to add property in, there's always going to be a base valuation. So as you can see, that's that blue line that goes across. So whatever that property is when the TID is created or it is amended continues to be taxed at its normal level. So if it's, vacant land or it's, there was something on there, those taxes are still being split up to all of the taxing jurisdictions. What essentially is being agreed upon by all of the taxing entities is what is the increment over the base, is so that if there is anything new that is done on that property. So for instance, if it's vacant farmland and you now have a new subdivision that comes on, all of that new subdivision taxes are essentially what is the increment over the base. So that money is essentially pooled and goes into the TIF district that then can be utilized by you as the city to fund projects or give incentives, et cetera. So then what happens, as you can see, is that continues to grow, and then you get kind of into the gray area, which is the new tax base, which essentially then what happens is when you close the district, all of those taxes now then go back to all of the taxing jurisdictions kind of on a one lump sum basis. Okay, so this just kind of gives you a projection again of kind of how we verified those but-for tests. So this is the current Fort Atkinson and combined mill rate. So in 2024 for 2023 purposes, the city's mill rate was $6.88 per $1,000 of equalized value. The combined mill rate of all the overlapping taxing entities, so again, that's your school district, your county, your technical college, and the city, was $20.32 per $100,000 for $1,000 of equalized value. So again, when you're considering a project, so let's say you have something that potentially is going to generate about $1 million worth of increment. If the city were only to use their tax rate to essentially cover the projects, what it would generate is about $6,880 of tax revenue annually. But by combining all of the taxing jurisdictions together, you have $20,320 that essentially is able to be utilized. So that's where you talk about that but-for test and kind of does it pass the test, is without, combining all the taxing jurisdictions, 20,000 is a lot different than 6. So when you're considering having to do, whether it's grants or you're putting in infrastructure or you're doing improvements to facilities, that's one of the reasons why they have that but-for test that you kind of have to satisfy. Okay, the other thing that kind of flows into tax increment districts is what is called the equalized value test. So the equalized value of the proposed TID plus the value increment of all existing TIDs may not exceed 12% of the municipality's total equalized value. So what happens is the DOR releases equalized values for the current year annually on August 15th. So we actually just got these finalized. The equalized value test is based on figures available at the time the TID creation resolution is adopted by the governing body. So you do have a little bit of kind of wiggle room sometimes with this, where if you're right at that 12%, as long as you would get your resolution in before they do the 15th, the DOR basically says, nope, we're going to count it as if it didn't happen. If you delay and wait and all of a sudden now you're above that 12%, you no longer can do anything, or we have to kind of come up with some different ideas. So those are things we're always kind of analyzing when we're talking with obviously Michelle and Rebecca, when we're kind of looking at kind of game planning for TIFs. But how this works essentially for the statutory test limit is the total equalized value right now for the city is $1.4 billion. 12% of that is about $170 million. So right now, the total TID increments, so those are all your TIDs, have about $87.4 million. So that's at 6.15%. So what that means is right now you have a remaining capacity of about $83 million. So 5.85. So either you could do amendments, you could do new TID creations if that would be necessary. You do have some pretty good flexibility right now. You know, there are other municipalities that are either blowing that out of the water or are basically kind of right on that, teetering on that line. So you definitely have some good flexibility when you're talking about tax increment districts here for the city. All right, so just briefly kind of hitting on some financing options. So really, to kind of make it as simple as possible, there's really two ways we try to finance a TID. One is called upfront. So essentially what this means is you're projecting the increment property value of the project and you extend an upfront payment to assist in the development costs. So what this means essentially in a nutshell is you have a developer, let's say there's, you know, Target is coming to the city. I don't think you guys have a Target, but I'm trying to remember an example that makes sense. So let's say Target is coming to the city. Okay, not starting rumors, but just an example. So let's say Target all of a sudden comes to Rebecca and says, hey, we're interested in coming to the city for Atkins. So one of the options is what's called basically upfront. So what would happen is in a development agreement, the city would work with Target and essentially say, okay, we want you to guarantee that you're going to build a Target that is going to be assessed at $16 million. If you hit that assessment, we essentially then will give you an upfront incentive of $1 million. You know, that's what's called upfront. The reason that is a little bit risky is that assumes the city is taking on that risk. You have no idea if it's going to assess out at that. You're just going to assume. So that's one of the things where, you know, sometimes it is necessary in order to get a developer here that you have to do that. But what we like to see more on the financial advisor end, and I know Rebecca's kind of in the same boat here, is we do pay-as-you-go financing. So what this essentially is, it relies on the developer to pay for the upfront project costs with the promise of being reimbursed. So in the same example, think about Target. They're going to say, hey, we're going to build something that's going to be $16 million. Okay, they do it. If they hit that $16 million, there's an agreed upon incentive that they potentially could get that they get then taxed. So they pay their taxes, it goes into the TIF. The city then essentially gives them a pay-go payment, an incentive payment up to a certain amount. And essentially that's how they get whatever amount is agreed upon. So if it's that $1 million, it would be paid over a certain amount of years. The advantage to that is obviously the developer is assuming the risk. So you are not having to go out and issue debt. You're not having to do anything. It's basically forcing the developer to do that. So we always try to push that method forward. But as we know, developers know how this works as well. So it's a back and forth. But those are kind of the two, you know, basic options. There obviously are a lot of different scenarios and things that can play into it, but we wanted to kind of keep it as simple as possible for you guys and give you kind of the top two options that are out there. All right, so now what we wanted to do, I guess, any questions on that before we start going into kind of your individual TIDs and just give a recap?
Are there any instances where a developer would prefer a pay-as-you-go scenario?
It depends. So sometimes they do, for specifically if they're going to their bank and getting a, you know, particular rate, that's one of the scenarios I know I've worked on with kind of municipalities. Is a developer wanted to ensure that if they were able to get a pay-go and get a certain dollar amount, they then could go to their bank and their bank was willing to give them a reduction in their interest rate. So a lot of it is just credit. So generally the other reason that sometimes pay-go becomes better for the municipalities, especially as there is infrastructure, is knowing that as municipalities, you know, the money is so thin when you're trying to figure out projects and everything else, that if you can work with a developer that's willing to do that, you can incentivize them more than you would be able to do with an upfront incentive. So that's kind of where I think the game has gone a little bit more, is that developers are starting to understand, you know, when you consider whether it's a subdivision or it's any type of commercial property that's going to need, you know, water, sewer, roads, they are now becoming more willing and understanding that, okay, well, if I put that in, will you basically reimburse me that over the life of the TID? Well, sure. If the revenue's coming in and it obviously cash flows, that's a perfect model. So we've seen a lot more of that. But, depending on, I would say the area where we see PAYGO probably needing the most is when you're talking about, usually it's apartments or housing. Because when they're trying to get to a certain level of affordability, the problem right now is they can't get their numbers to cash flow. So in order for, to be able to have it be at a certain rate that obviously is affordable for the community, they need some form of gap coverage in order to get there. So that's where we're seeing a lot of kind of typically if you're giving some type of upfront incentive, it's usually towards that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You may have kind of touched on this, going back to page 6 or slide 6. So basically, as a city, we would have to understand based on what are the projects happening within those TIDs, because it may push, like based on what happens in a certain year, may push the equalized value to go over 12% within that TID. So the way I understand this is we'd have to kind of understand when TIDs would be closing. We'd have to kind of get a best educated estimate of what the value may be or what the projects are happening like with our Banker Road development. If we build too much too fast, that could theoretically push us over that 12% limit.
Theoretically, but I don't think we will have to worry about that because
Okay.
we'll go through the plan that we have for the timeline for our TIDs.
Okay, understood.
Yep.
The
Nope.
complexities of the planning behind the scenes, I guess.
It is, it is something that as Rebecca looked, I mean, so right now you've got about 83 million to play with. So unless you have, a huge development coming in, which that's what we hope for.
Right.
Those are the things that absolutely we start to look and model that out is go, okay, if we know that you're getting close to, you've got a development that's occurring and it's going to have a huge impact. Also now as you're seeing with the fact that with reassessments and everything else, that's also jacking up your equalized value rate. So it's all the things we kind of look at when we model in and make sense. Okay, this TID doesn't make sense to close. Because again, with the TIF law, the rule is once you've paid off all your projects and everything else, you are required by the law to close it. So there's things that we're going to be talking about here about kind of what you can do when you get to that point. But absolutely, those are things that you want to kind of continue to monitor and look at the total picture. It's a big puzzle. Yep. Absolutely.
Adam, can you also just, this is our equalized value you used the equalized tax rate on the other slide. I just want to make the distinction between that equalized rate and the basically the mill rate, which use assessed value. So I just want to make sure that people understand the distinction there, because when you get your tax bill, your rate was not $20.32 per thousand. So that
Right.
is the equalized rate. And then that's where our assessment ratio comes into play.
Yep.
Because we use assessed value. So when I present in the budget document annually what our municipal and then overall mill rate is, that is based on assessed value, not equalized. But maybe Adam, you can touch on why we use equalized for the
Yes.
TID.
So the reason we use equalized is because when you go back to considering creating a tax increment district, you have all of the taxing jurisdictions. What's interesting is municipalities are the only taxing jurisdiction that uses assessed value. Everybody uses equalized value to essentially create what Rebecca alluded to as the rate then that goes on the tax bill. So essentially to try to make it as complicated for municipalities as possible, but as easy for everybody else, was essentially they made the decision to use equalized value. So that's where you will see a little bit of fluctuation between, this is saying it's $6.88. As Rebecca alluded to, normally your assessed value is either more or it's, sometimes less.
Right,
So it just
depending on
kinda-
the assessment ratio.
Yeah.
So we did the reval in 23, but we're not right at 100. I think we're at, 97.5 or something like that, which, was last year after the reval. We weren't even quite to 100.
Yeah. So what happens with this is how you get the equalized value is and Michelle knows this, there's the tax increment worksheet that you get to fill out every year. That's essentially everything is based on, it takes your levy amount that comes from your mill rate and essentially uses that to create what then is truly your equalized value. So it's supposed to be close, as kind of Rebecca alluded to. Sometimes it is, and sometimes depending on where you are in your assessment ratio, it kind of does this kind of little fluctuation deal. So. Okay, so now what we wanted to kind of do was just briefly touch on kind of what is going on in all of the kind of tax increment districts. And what this is going to lead into is kind of some future discussions and conversations. And I think as Eric, you brought up with looking at kind of game planning for the future. So with TID 6, what's going on here is this is essentially right now a donor district. So because of the fact that, if you look at this, there's the orange section that says TID status. It essentially is an O. You can see right now the current status of that district is in the red. So what is happening right now is when you go to the blue area, which is the revenue on the screen, those are the revenues that are coming in. This TID is essentially getting financial support from two other TIF districts. So that's TIF District 7 and TIF District 8. So what happens is you have to go through the process of essentially having either it's called an allocation amendment or essentially you do an amendment to your TID to allow those TIDs to essentially that possibly have surplus revenue can give it to this TID to support it. So what we're showing right now is we're hoping that over the next kind of 2 years here in 2024 and 2025, it is going to receive support from TID 7 and TID 8. And then potentially we're going to start looking at closing that district out. We'll kind of get into that into a little bit.
So just a couple notes.
Yeah.
Adam. You had said donor at first, but this is a distressed TID, right?
Yes.
The other two, 7 and 8 are donors to this distressed TID number 6. And then I also want to point out that I know it's hard to see these numbers. This was in the packet, as well as part of the report to the Joint Review Board that I included in the workshop packet. I will note that this does include a $1.3 million payment from TID 8 that is part of the subject of tonight's city council meeting, and a budget amendment transferring some additional funds. So this pro forma is based on the transfer, the approval of the budget amendment and transfer of TID funds from 8 to support 6. So with this timeline in potentially closing in 2026, that is based on the budget amendment that will be before the council tonight.
So then TID district number 7, as Rebecca alluded to, is a donor TID. So what is happening with this one is particularly it has met kind of all of its financial obligations. So that is why it is able to be a donor TID. So what is happening is the revenue that is coming in is essentially being utilized then to go to TID number 6 to offset those costs. So as we're kind of playing all this out right now, the timeline and game plan that we're looking at is that this particular TID would have about 2 years, 2024 and 2025 of essentially donations. And then we'd be looking right around that kind of 2026 timeframe to potentially either kind of talk about doing a 1-year extension for affordable housing, which we'll get into in a little bit, or then looking at potentially closing that out.
Is there a time limit how long a donor TID can remain a donor?
There is, so it's not able to exceed its maximum life. So right now with this TID, it's 2033 is what is essentially in there. And that's 27 years plus the 6 years of donation. So really what happens is there's no TIF police, I guess would be the best way to put it. But the DOR essentially looks at that and it makes sure that, once it sees that if this truly has been shown in the plan that it's supporting TID number 6, once TID number 6 has finally got back into essentially a positive cash balance, then everything should kind of fall into line. Is TID 6 should be then closing, and then your donor TID essentially should be closing unless you do a extension for affordable housing or something else along those lines. But yeah, generally you can't exceed, once you get the approval for it to be a donor TID, which this was, it does extend up to 6 years that you can kind of, allow donations. So right now it's 2033 is you would not be able to exceed that. So as you're kind of having conversations tonight, if you don't do that donation, what is, that transfer, that then goes into the conversation of, okay, then we have to kind of look and reanalyze what that means for potentially pushing out, future years of payments.
And it can remain open even if it's not donating those, donating funds to another TID, or is that
I think
too
we'll,
deep into the weeds?
no, it's not. And the other piece that we haven't really talked about is the end of the expenditure period for TIDs.
Yes.
So a blight elimination TID 7 has a life of 27 years, but the expenditure period is 22 years. So it can stay open that extra 5 years. If for a regular mixed use TID,
Right.
the life is 25 years, but the expenditure period is 20 years. Okay, so that will get into what we talk about later. TID number 7, the expenditure period closed in
Yep.
2022.
Shoot.
So we are not able to keep the TID open and spend that money on projects in the TID at this point. That stopped in 2022. So 2022 was 22 years.
Yep.
Okay. And then 2027 is the extra 5 years. And then to get to 2033 was the 6-year extension, because in 2011, we amended this TID to become a donor TID for 6. And that is a similar process for 8. When we get into 8, the end of the expenditure period is September of 2024. So I mean, I'm getting ahead. So let's,
Nope, you're good. Yes, but to answer the question that you kind of started is yes, if truly you were no longer making donations to it, then as Rebecca alluded to, you have to close it because of the fact, if you had the ability to play with it, potentially, but with this one, no. It's once it's paid off, you got to close it.
and if there's cash in it, when you close, you have to distribute that back to the other taxing jurisdictions in the same percentage that it came in. So we would take that last tax bill and look at the percentages up for each taxing jurisdiction. So let's say there's $500,000 at the end of, whatever year, and we say, okay, we're going to close the TID. Then we'd have to distribute that back out. So the goal, obviously, for efficiency is to have that be 0 at the end.
Yes, and the reason you're doing the donations is essentially it's the opposite effect, is if you didn't, then when you close that district, that's the one thing with TIF districts is that falls back on you as the municipality. So instead of the other taxing jurisdictions having to kind of help in absorbing that cost, they do not. It is just you then as the municipality takes on that kind of risk reward. So. All right, so then we have tax increment district number 8. So as Rebecca alluded to, this was created in 2009. So the final year to incur costs was 2024. And then the maximum legal life is 2033. So that was the 20 years plus the 4 years of as donor to distressed. So potentially this is what's going to kind of be the big conversation point for you as a council tonight, is looking at, right now there's about $1.3 million of available balance in the audit. It was what it was showing. So kind of projecting when you include the 2024 tax rate that came in plus the numbers, you have some options. There is a debt payment that is still on there. So what we've kind of calculated is about $1.3 million is what is potentially available to be donated to TID number 6 to kind of help almost kind of spearhead a little bit of a quicker timeline in looking at options of either closing kind of districts or getting TID number 6 back into a positive balance. So what this is kind of showing, particularly right now in this pro forma, is that we'd be looking at essentially, having everything kind of finalized here in 2024 with payments. And then potentially in 2025, having some discussions about either doing a 1-year affordable housing extension, which I'll get into here in a second, but then also looking at closing the district in 2025, which then, as you just kind of alluded to, also then would drop your 12% because then you no longer have that in TIDs. So that would open up again some additional capacity. As you can see here, there's about 16 million, there's about 76 million in TIF increment that essentially will go onto the general fund, which is great for the city, because obviously then that helps you when you're considering trying to do some projects that are outside of the TID. That's one of the benefits is you get that big bump.
47 million is the increment over the base.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So the value of the whole, including the base value,
76.
is that 76 million. So the taxes, when this district closes, the taxes based on $47 million will be distributed to all taxing jurisdictions on an annual basis. So you can understand how positive it is for a community as a whole when a TID closes.
Yeah, and that also goes to show, the impact that TIFs have. If you look at it, that was 47 million of potential new construction increment that was created. Whereas if you didn't have the district, that, as it would say, but for that's not going to occur. So that is, you have some great TIDs that are showing the benefits of why you create TIF districts to basically improve your municipality. All right. So we're not going to get into too much detail on these because these are obviously your newer ones, but this is TID number 9. So we just kind of put a pro forma that you can see here, and very common. So this one was created in 2022. So it's very common that you can see when you're kind of looking at the overall TID status in those first few years, you're in the red, is because you don't really have any kind of construction increment occurring and you are incurring kind of project costs to kind of get everything going. But what we're showing here is it's estimating about 32 million in construction increment kind of occurring between 2025 and 2030. And then when you consider all of the kind of future debt service, hypothetical payments to developers and administrative expenses, right now it is showing, once we get past kind of that 2027 year, it starts to cash flow and then really starts to have obviously some positive increment. That could be further discussions then that the council could have about looking in your project plan as to, okay, what could be done as far as further projects? Were there particular roads within the half mile? Were there particular other projects? Were there park projects, different things like that that you would want to take on? So it's in its infancy stages, but it's looking pretty good right now.
And I will just mention that this TID 9 is an overlay of TID 8. So it is on the city's northwest side and it was created in 22, starting in tax year 2023, in order to support the Banker Road development, among other developments. So we took the undeveloped and underdeveloped land from TID 8. And then we also included newly annexed land, including the city-owned land and the land on the west side of the bypass. That those were all included in this TID 9.
Rebecca, you want to give a quick description of what TID number 10 is?
Sure. So TID 10 is on the city's northeast side. It is a blight elimination TID, and that is the first project. I should mention in TID 9, we do not have any development agreements yet in TID 9, but we are working on one. In TID 10, we just recently executed a development agreement with Fort Healthcare to support a smaller project. It's a road project. They paid for the infrastructure. We will pay back in a pay-go based on the increment that they have provided. Or that the increment based on the development that they're putting together. So right now it's just a few houses, but in the future, it will likely be more significant than that. So as Adam pointed out, it is very common for the first few years of these tax increment districts to run a negative. And all that means is that the general fund right now has paid out that money, and this is all tracked and accounted for. And so when the TID starts, when there's increment in the TID, it will be paid back to the general fund first before any money goes out the door per development agreements.
Absolutely. Okay, so what we kind of wanted to walk through is, as we've talked about, particularly with kind of TID 6, 7, and 8, was working with the staff, kind of coming up with a game plan of what could be done for affordable housing extensions, and then looking at kind of closures, and then also potentially creating a new district once we've kind of closed. So where we are kind of on the top of this is today. So what we have is the city council kind of TID workshop. And then potentially there's going to be a resolution at your common council meeting right after this to talk about creating the TID number 8 affordable housing extension resolution. What'll happen then is the game plan then would be Tuesday, April 1st. The common council would be getting together and meeting to adopt the TID number 8 termination resolution. So we'd be looking to terminate the TID. And then on Tuesday, August 19th in 2025, we kind of come back again, do another workshop, and then have some conversations about particularly 6 and 7 and doing affordable housing extension resolutions for those two TIDs. And then in April of 2026, we essentially would do termination resolutions for those two. And then we would start the process kind of in July of then considering looking at, possibly the creation of TID number 11 and then TID number 12 if it made sense. And then going through the process where when you do a TID creation, it usually takes about 3 months. So as you can see here, we've got kind of July, August, and then in September, everything would be adopted and created for those districts. And then the deadline is you have to submit everything to the DOR by October 30th or 31st of kind of that year. So as you can see, we'd be rounding out then October 30th of 2026, potentially sending in those possible creations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about TID affordable housing extensions, because that's obviously going to be a topic that's going to come up here at your next meeting. So after a municipality pays off a TID's project costs, it can extend the TID's life by 1 year if the municipality adopts a resolution that, number one, extends the life for a specific number of months. You have up to 12 months essentially that you can extend the district. Generally what happens is kind of just kind of our timeline is when you close a district, April 15th of every year is kind of the cutoff date. So if you want to be able to close it in the year that you're essentially approving the resolution, it has to be done before April 15th. If you close it after, then essentially it's the next year is when that kind of goes into effect. So that's where, you know, you can have it up to 12 months, but most municipalities will put that in there to kind of give them some cushion, but then they look to kind of close right at that April 15th kind of deadline, because more than likely they've collected all the taxes and everything else to kind of put into that fund. The other thing that you have to do is essentially specify how the municipality intends to improve the housing stock. This is one of the things right now that with the Department of Revenue is very much open right now to interpretation. They have the rule basically right now on their website says that affordable housing is defined as, I believe, 30% of the gross household income. But there are really no, you know, there are a lot of parameters right now. There's not a lot of kind of guidance. So the floor is kind of open. What it does say though, is that the municipality must use at least 75% of the increment received to benefit affordable housing. The remainder must be used to improve housing. And then the resolution must be sent to the DOR for their approval. So what happens is there's a template that essentially is out here on this page on the DOR's website that the municipality can kind of use to create it. And what you have to do is kind of put all that information in there and then specify how the municipality intends to improve the housing stock. So what I can kind of give you is an example of one. So when I was in Platteville, what we did is we extended one of our TIDs by a year. And what we did was, because Platteville is a college town, we had a lot of homes, and also it was a mining town. We had a lot of homes that were built essentially from 1950 and older. So we created essentially two, what we called them as grant programs to improve the housing. So one was if it was a home that was 1950 or older, a person could get up to $25,000 to essentially make improvements. They had to do the improvements first. They then would submit them into the city, and then we would essentially reimburse them. The other kind of housing program that we put in is because being a college town, we had a lot of single family homes that were essentially turned into multiplexes. So we gave an incentive to essentially, you know, have people turn them back into single family homes. So what we see a lot of municipalities doing are kind of a lot of varying things. They will do grant programs. Otherwise, they will just do flat out, you know, here's the money that we collected. So let's say it's $500,000. They'll make it real simple. They'll give out two grants essentially for $250,000. The biggest thing you want to remember to this is to try to make it as easy for the staff as possible, because as we all know, the staff holds multiple hats. So the more complex you make your kind of grant program, the harder it is to track and the more you have to track it. So that's where you see a lot of municipalities tend to go more kind of not simplistic, but a flat dollar amount. So these are all kind of the things that potentially are going to be conversations that you're going to want to think about kind of as you move forward. So then kind of as we talked about with TID terminations, so what happens here is the municipality must terminate the TID according to the deadlines established by the law. So to terminate a TID, you must follow the steps. So the first thing you have to do is you have to adopt the termination resolution. So as we talked about, we'd be looking at kind of that first few weeks in April, having the council adopt a termination resolution. Then what the staff has to do is they have to complete form PE 223, which is basically just kind of a summary that goes to the DOR showing that you terminated. Here's the dates, and kind of locks in a couple of things. It locks in essentially that kind of window of when you have to complete your TID final audit. So whatever the resolution is, you essentially get a year from that point to have your auditors kind of go in. And then that also starts the clock where you have to e-file what's called a PE 110 with the Department of Revenue, which is once you kind of get your auditors to do the final audit. And this is really kind of alluding to what Rebecca was talking about, where, you know, if you have any money in there, you essentially have to showcase how that was kind of paid out or distributed. So that's what your kind of accounting methods do. That's why the goal is always, if you get it to zero, your report becomes pretty easy, because then it just shows you had money came in, you had money go out, you have nothing left. So then you submit it. Again, your final accounting report must show either three things. One, that your increment was returned to the taxing jurisdictions, your increment was not enough to cover the costs, or that your final balances were zero. So then there's two forms, just we kind of talked about here for you to see. There's the termination resolution, which again is kind of a template that comes from the DOR. And then there's that PE 223 that has to be filled out, which essentially shows kind of the final accounting submission date information. So kind of things to think about as far as the next steps here for you as the council is, you know, considering obviously a TID budgetary amendment to reallocate the approximately about $1.3 million from TID 8 to TID number 6 to kind of help kickstart this process. And then also start, considering obviously the affordable housing extension resolution. So that is going to be in front of you, I believe, tonight to have discussions on that. And then really one of the things that we kind of wanted to leave open was to allow a little discussion about, potential affordable housing program opportunities. So I kind of mentioned a few. I don't know, Rebecca, if there's anything else you kind of wanted to add before we kind of open up the floor to that.
Yes, so I will mention just a couple more things. One, in the packet that we sent out for this meeting, there was a draft resolution extending the life of the TID number 8 for 1 year to fund affordable housing programs. So it includes all of the requirements that the form did that Adam alluded to, but then also included be it further resolved that, so it would be remaining open for 12 months and that will use the final increment to improve housing quality and affordability by developing and implementing a program with one or more of the following elements: down payment assistance, construction incentives, investment in public infrastructure, and or home improvement grants. So those are just general categories that are included in this resolution, and almost anything that we can come up with as far as a program would fit into one of those general categories. So that's what we are looking at right now, is telling the state, these are the general categories that we're looking on spending this money on. And then I also included just some sample programs with this, and Adam doesn't have them as part of his presentation, so we can't pull them up, but they are in the packet on page 26 and 27 in the packet for this workshop. And those include a really important function, right? Which is number one, anticipated revenues for an affordable housing program, right? So the increment generated in 2025 for TID number 8 is estimated to be about $1.1 million. So that would come if if the budget amendment is approved tonight, and if the affordable housing resolution is approved tonight. That means in 2025, roughly $1.1 million would go into this affordable housing fund. We would likely get that in April-ish. So we have some time between, if those resolutions are approved tonight and when we implement this program, we have some time to talk about what kind of programs we want to put into place. The document that I included has some sample programs. A down payment assistance program for affordable housing. So I have, for an example, $25,000, potentially 10 such projects. So that would be down payment assistance for home buyers, single family condo, single family owner occupied residential unit, whose total household income is at or below the median household income for Jefferson County. They must own the home for 5 years. It's a grant program. With just as a point, an informational point, the 2022 census has the median household income in Jefferson County as $78,628,000. Just to give you some context as to who would be eligible for these types of things. Another sample is an affordable home improvement grant program for affordable. That could be, $10,500. We could do 6 of them. And that could be housing stock built before, I have in the sample 1990, but that is one of those arbitrary numbers that I would, if we want to do a program like that, get feedback on that. Another is multifamily development incentive program for affordable housing. So that I have potentially $250,000 for such grants. And that would be at a grant incentive payment to a developer for constructing a new multifamily apartment building with at least 12 units. Units must be affordable, meaning not more than 30% of gross household income for the renter for 10 years. And that grants cannot be more than 15% of the total project cost, just to put some guardrails, I'll call them, on some of these programs. And then the last sample program that's included in this document is multifamily development incentive program for market rate, which would be slightly less at $100,000. We could do up to 4 of them, and that would be same type of parameters as the affordable multifamily development incentive. except for market, and they could be used together to allow a developer to build a larger unit apartment building that had both affordable and market rate apartments. So like I said, those are some samples. The important thing I want, and so I also included a sample programs budget just to show what we would anticipate kind of how this program would be implemented. We would get roughly that $1.1 million in 2025 for TID 8. And then if we continue on that path that Adam, that we've kind of laid out, that would mean that in 2026, the increment from TID 7 and the increment from TID 6 would go into that affordable housing fund. So as of the numbers right now, we would anticipate about $407,000 from TID 7. So that would be the potential 2026 increment from TID 7 that would go into that affordable housing fund. And then the potential 2026 increment for TID 6 is $143,000. So all in, the closure of these 3 TIDs over 2025 and 2026 would equate to about $1.7 million. And then I have just those sample programs. This is on page 28 of the 27 of the packet, just shows how we would anticipate the programs kind of going, the funds going out the door through these programs. Now, obviously these programs need a lot of work, right? Just having a spreadsheet doesn't make a program. We need applications, and we need, all of the guidelines and all of the things, and we need to figure out how we would administer it on our part. So that is what we would be working on for the next several months. And right now, I would like to take some time to get some feedback from the council on some of these sample programs and what the council anticipates for sample affordable housing programs and or all of the things that we kind of presented tonight, which I understand is a lot of information. I work in this every day, so I apologize if we went too fast or if there's too much information. But this, I also just want to express how excited I am about this opportunity. This is kind of a once in a lifetime type, once in a career type opportunity to really affect and improve housing in the city of Fort Atkinson. And to put all this value after this 1 year, put all this value back on the tax base. It really will be transformational for our taxing jurisdictions, less so the technical college and the county, because they've got a much bigger tax base. But for the school district and for the city, this is transformational. So it's a really big deal, and I'm really excited about it. And for the last 3 years, I've been here. Every time I've reported to the Joint Review Board, I've said, this is what's next. This is our plan. This is, we just got to keep on keeping on with this plan to pay down the debt and pay down all of the general fund monies owed, the monies owed from TID 6 to the general fund, and pay all that down. So we have this opportunity. So we really have stayed the course over the last several years and donated and taken those, the opportunity that we have to donate funds from our successful TIDs 7 and 8 to 6 to pay down that debt. And now actually the end is in sight. So I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. It's the stuff that makes us. You can tell what gets us excited. It's sad, but it's fun.
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments, and bear with me. I'm going to generate these ideas as I'm thinking through them. So I'm not an economist, so like the down payment support, I'd be a little concerned that like just some things I've heard, or even if I knew that someone was going to be buying my house and that the government was going to be giving them an extra $25,000 to buy my house, in the back of my mind, I would raise the price of my house so I could like it's artificially inflating the house. It potentially could artificially inflate the price of housing. I do really like the idea of, using that to build or incentivize a developer to build more properties. I do believe that we're just at such a housing shortage right now that to help everyone with either they're spreading the tax base or managing housing costs, that more housing is most likely the answer. One that gets more places for people to live, starts to shift sellers, let me rephrase this, buyers competing to buy a house versus sellers competing for buyers. So with more stock, you have to attract buyers. If there's such limited stock, you have too many buyers and that inflates housing prices. No, I'm sorry if that was a little bit wordy. Again, I'm not an economist, but that's my general feeling is how could that be used to incentivize more housing to be built? So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Rebecca, if I can jump in really quick, I was excited about what I heard tonight. I agree with you. I appreciate Adam's presentation. I think the programs you laid out all have potential and can be fleshed out. Like I shared with you the other day, sometimes the devil's kind of in the details of these things, and I know the city attorney might have to vet things to make sure that complies with like housing laws and such, but I agree with what Councilman Schultz said. I sometimes am a little bit apprehensive. I know there can be downsides with the down payment assistance, though I'm not necessarily against that program. I think we just have to be careful with it. But in general, anything we can do to grow the housing supply right now is greatly appreciated.
Thanks.
Do you know, does the county, I know when I bought my house, the county offered the first time home buyers grant. Do they still offer that you know of, or?
I'm not sure that they do grants, but I know they have the Jefferson County at Home program
Okay,
where they do housing counseling and financial counseling.
okay,
I'm not sure if there's still a first time grant or not.
okay. Cause I know when I bought mine, as long as you kind of in the same instance here, you qualified as a income and then, the house had to meet certain requirements. They'd give you some down payment assistance, wasn't nearly this much. And that's where I kind of feel with, Councilman Schultz here, that 25,000 is kind of a big number to be given out. Cause that's 20% of a lot of the houses in the town. I know at the time when I did the first time home buyers, that was $5,000 to $11,000 grant, depending on how the house qualified. So I think I'd kind of shy away from that big of a number. And at that point, you could help out a little more, but I do like the idea of going with more of the multifamily incentives to help out.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you.
Adam, what are you seeing in other communities that are doing this? Is what we're kind of looking at, and while it's not set in stone, this is just kind of getting the conversation started. Are they implementing similar programs with similar dollar amounts?
Yes. Yeah. I would say, when Rebecca, I kind of looked at it, we looked at, I'm up in the Ashwaubenon area, so I kind of vetted, De Pere, Howard, a lot of those places that have, Howard has a similar population, Hobart, different places like that. Generally, they're doing kind of, bulk, again, to allow kind of alleviate some of the stress on staff. They're doing more, dollar amount fixed grants versus, kind of percentages and different things. But yes, it usually is kind of twofold. I would say one is something in the form of a, discount for first time home buyers. And then the other one is an incentive, a twofold incentive to developers to either, increase housing stock or to somehow, allow them to use that funding to essentially reduce either their rate so that the, if it's an apartment, essentially, if it's, technically they would be putting it out for $1,800 a month, by doing some type of an incentive program, you can now get it down to 900, something along those lines. So I would say the ones that you're looking at are kind of the more common ones that we're seeing kind of be established.
And as I said before, those are sample dollar amounts, you know, there's sample distribution between the four types of programs. We can certainly adjust any of those levers to, you know, prioritize multifamily. I'm kind of hearing that there's a prioritization of multifamily versus single family. So in that way, we would shift more of the program dollars to multifamily.
I know right when I came on council, we had the one development going in kind of out by the high school, and that kind of got feathered out because of everything. So I see there's a bunch of opportunity for these developments that are already set to go, but they're just lacking the funds.
Yeah, there's some gaps, right? And so that's one of the reasons we created TID 9 in that area, was to fill some gaps. But we've found in our negotiations with developers and are talking to developers that TID does not fill the whole gap, that there's more of a gap.
Yeah.
So it would be, you know, my goal that a program like this could help fill that additional gap.
Rebecca, do you mind if I comment as well, being on the Joint Review Board and Economic Development Commission? Jonah Ralston here. And just real quickly, I was just going to also piggyback and say that I would much prefer to see supply side incentives. I mean, for a first time home buyer, you can get an FHA loan and you really only need 3.5% of the purchase price for a down payment. And that seems pretty feasible given the housing stock here. I think the bigger issue is that there isn't enough housing stock, particularly, when you think of multifamily housing. You know, I have an elderly mother, for example, and just trying to find something that's affordable for her has been a real challenge on a fixed income in the county. And so, I would much prefer to see us focus on that, because I also have same concerns about, the inflation that can happen for housing prices when you use demand side incentives for something like this.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, we have just a couple minutes left here. There will be a lot of opportunity for more input on this and to kind of flesh this out, something where we're all comfortable with. I think in general, what I'm hearing though is that we agree that this is something worth pursuing further.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam.
Sure.
And we will, we have about 4 minutes before the regular city council meeting. So I think we'll go ahead and end the workshop here. And we will prepare for the next meeting. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.